Good evening. Thank you for coming tonight to our pre-Constitution Day celebration. We're a couple days early. That's because the debate team's off to their first debate this weekend, so we wish them a lot of luck with that. But we're very proud again to have with us for our Constitution Day celebration the national champion SIUC Debate Team. And this is our 5th year that we've been doing this, and it's been a great partnership for the Morris Library, and we hope they've gotten a lot out of it too. My name's Walter Ray. I'm the political papers archivist here. This is Anna Zhang. She's the government documents librarian. One of the reasons we do these Constitution Day debates is because Morris Library is a federal depository library for government documents. We're the largest depository library in Southern Illinois. And one of the requirements for being a depository library is that we honor the Constitution. So that's what we're doing here tonight. And again, welcome to the debate team and its coach, Todd Graham. I'm going to turn it over to Todd Graham. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Walter Ray and Anna. And if you see Anna's son here, he turned 11 years old today. So if you see Joshua outside afterwards for punch and cookies, make sure and say, where is he? Stand up. Oh, there he is. Stand up. 11 years old today. Happy birthday. Happy birthday. I'd like to first introduce our debate team. That would be the debate team of Southern Illinois University, the 1988, 1996, 2008, 2013, 2014, and 2015 national champions of debate. In the middle is our dog pound. These are our coaches for this year that will be asking questions of the debaters during the debate. So first is Ben Reid. Ben is a master's degree student. Go ahead, that's fine. Yeah, he's got a wave. Ben is a master's degree student, and Ben was the top debater at the national championship his senior year. Next to him is our other coach, Zach Schneider. Zach is our reigning national champion. He graduated last year with Josh. He won the national championship for SIU this last year. Now, debating for us today is Bobby Swetz. He will be on the affirmative. And Arielle Stephenson on the negative. They're brand new debaters to the SIU program. We expect very good things from them. Today, the Constitution Day is when we debate parts of the Constitution every year. This is our 5th year. We've made it up to the 5th Amendment. So as you can see sort of on your program, you can see that it's what we're debating today is the section, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. There's more to the 5th Amendment. We might even debate the second half of it, the eminent domain half, next year. But for now, that's what we will be debating. The affirmative debater, Bobby, will dare the negative debater, Arielle, to defend either civil asset forfeiture laws or indefinite detention do not violate the 5th Amendment of the Constitution. So in other words, Bobby will have to say that both of them violate, taking property like money, cars, houses, and indefinite detention, like being put in prisons, being put in jail without due process, etc. He has to say that both of those violate due process of the law, whereas Arielle only has to win that one of the two does not, in fact, violate the due process. What to expect from this debate? The speeches aren't memorized. It's a debate. So, they're extemporaneous doing this, so it's not a sort of a professional memorized presentation, so don't expect that, but you should expect good quality clash, and hopefully you'll learn some new arguments about the 5th Amendment. What also to expect is a punch and pie afterwards out in the hallway. Please make sure your cell phones are currently turned off. Not silent, not to buzz, but all the way to the off position. The final thing we do before we begin the debate is I actually ask you to vote before the debate and then vote after the debate. So what will happen is I would like you to look at the topic that's in front of you. I dare you to defend that civil asset forfeiture laws or the practice of indefinite detention do not violate the 5th Amendment. So in other words, Bobby is saying that both of them violate due process. Arielle will be saying that one or both of them do not violate it. I'm going to ask you if you agree with Bobby's position, as it is written, to stand at this moment, and I'll take a count. And then I'll ask the opposite to also stand at that moment. After the debate, I will see if anyone changed their mind. If you don't have an opinion yet, that's okay, you don't have to stand. But all of those who agree with Bobby's position right now, could you please stand? Ben and Zach will count. All of those who agree that Bobby is right, that those things violate the due process clause, please stand. That those two things, both indefinite detention and civil asset forfeiture, violate the due process clause, please stand. You have a good count? Thank you very much. We have a hard count. It's been written down. Everyone who disagrees, everyone who thinks that Arielle is right, that one or both of those do not violate the Fifth Amendment due process clause, please stand. Please stand if you believe that one or both of those do not violate the due process clause, either civil asset forfeiture or indefinite detention. Do not violate. Okay. Got a good count? Yeah. Okay, and then we will also, because a lot of you didn't vote, we'll be including the votes afterwards now to try to see a difference as well. The final thing that's different this year is you might notice on there's a little bit of audience questions. So the grand cross-examination toward the podium is both by the audience and the dog pound. Ben will go on one side, Zach will go on the other. They will have a microphone held in their hand. If you have a question, raise your hand, and you will be allowed to ask either Bobby or Arielle any question you'd like about the topic, about the debate. And if you think that they said something that didn't make sense or was wrong, or you would just like to grill them, feel free. You'll get help from the dog pound. Thank you very much.
Can y'all hear me all right? Cool. The Fifth Amendment sets the stage for the Due Process Clause. No person shall be held to answer for a crime unless through the due process of the court system and a grand jury. There are specifically two issues in front of us today: civil asset forfeiture and indefinite detention. According to the ACLU, the civil asset forfeiture allows the police to seize and then keep or sell any property they allege is involved in a crime. Owners need not ever be convicted or even arrested for their property, their cash, their cars, and their real estate to be taken away by local police departments. Similarly, the ACLU argues that indefinite detention means that people who have never even committed a crime or for who the government lacks reliable evidence of criminal conduct could be imprisoned indefinitely, perhaps for their entire lives, without charge or trial. Both represent key portions of police brutality that has been growing every day. Thus, I dare Arielle to defend that either civil asset forfeiture laws or the practice of indefinite detention do not violate the Fifth Amendment Due Process Clause. My first contention is that civil asset forfeiture is unconstitutional because it violates the Fifth Amendment. Originally aimed at curtailing criminal organizations, is now simply used as a tool for local police departments to gain profits and fund themselves. The victims never see a minute of court regarding their stolen assets, and the police are simply able to sell it off. Originally, assets would have to go through the general fund of the Treasury, but instead the local cops act as pirates, looking for booty from innocent people. According to a coalition of major civil organizations, such as the ACLU and the NAACP, called the Forfeiture Reform Coalition, forfeiture revenue and abusive have skyrocketed. One of the greatest examples of this injustice is Lyndon McClellan. He's a small business owner who had $172,702 simply removed from his bank account because he made too many small transactions, which the government thought he was laundering money. It took him months to actually go to court and receive his funds again. This is one small case in a sea of numerous cases. There are other cases of places at the border where if people were carrying too much money, the governments would just take that money away because they thought it was drug money. My second contention is that indefinite detention violates the Fifth Amendment. It is unconstitutional. Since 9/11 and the passage of the Patriot Act, the number of uses and abuses of indefinite detention has exponentially increased. The most iconic example of these is Guantanamo Bay, where people are waterboarded and tortured without seeing a grand jury or a minute of court. Sadly, is not only the military. This is not the only military base that has these heinous offenses. There's also other military bases, such as Abu Ghraib, and even military bases that we probably do not even know about, where people are sexually abused and arrested, taken away from their families, and shipped off to secret military bases somewhere around the world because they're just suspected terrorists. They never see a day in court. For example, Arielle is going to stand up and say that these are key to the war on terror and to stop terrorists around the world, but there have been numerous convictions in the court system for things like the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the 9/11 that should prove that we're able to use the court systems, and the court systems are effective for combating terrorism. She will also say that U.S. citizens are not liable to indefinite detention, but she's flat out wrong on this. In 2014, Obama signed an act called the NDAA, or the National Defense Authorization Act, which allows the indefinite detention of American citizens. Big names like Noam Chomsky, who is known as the father of modern linguistics and a professor at MIT, along with Daniel Ellsberg, who is famous for releasing the Pentagon Papers, both have challenged this, but were stonewalled by the federal government. They originally appealed and were successful in this, but then the government quickly appealed that decision, and it was again ruled constitutional. This means that any one of us could be captured at any minute under a guise of terrorism and shipped away to secret military bases wherever. And with that, I'm open for cross-ex.
All right. Oh, Bobby, just as an opening question, I guess I'd like to ask, what is the role of the Supreme Court?
The role of the Supreme Court is to test whether or not certain acts by Congress or maybe the president is unconstitutional, basically uphold the law.
Okay,
as you could say.
so we've established the role of the Supreme Court is to uphold the Constitution in the face of policy. Yet, you continue to describe laws and policies which have been called constitutional by the Supreme Court unconstitutional. My question is, why do you think you know better?
A, that is false. Originally, it was a lower circuit Supreme Court judge who ruled that the NDAA was then unconstitutional, but then a second appeals in the appellate court ruled that it was constitutional. It has never gone to the Supreme Court.
Right, we're not asking about the NDAA. We're asking about civil asset forfeiture laws like those that were reviewed in Bennis v. Michigan, which I know is a case that Zach is going to ask you about, and which were then clarified in cases like Minnesota v. Carter. I guess I'm curious about how you think this should be hashed out if there seems to be an authoritative standing already.
I mean, there's been authoritarian standings on a lot of issues. For example, in the 1800s and then 1900s, where black people were not allowed to vote and were decided as property by the Supreme Court until the 50s and 60s. Obviously, we should be able to challenge Supreme Court decisions as United States citizens.
So I have another quick question about civil asset forfeiture for you. So there's a number of cases that involve things that are known as Ponzi schemes, which essentially is people will fool investors into investing their money in a get-rich-quick scheme, and then they'll use that money to pay, or they'll get more investors and use those to pay out the first round, and so on and so forth. Essentially, you just get rich by taking people's money. So in the United States versus Scott W. Rothstein in 2009, the United States was able to use civil asset forfeiture to return $25.5 million to elderly people in Florida who had been fooled by his Ponzi scheme. And there are countless other cases of Ponzi schemes and other sorts of tricks by people stealing money from people where the money was able to be returned by civil asset forfeiture. If we get rid of civil asset forfeiture, what will happen to those people?
Those people, well, not even those people, but it would have to go through the court system to decide to get their money back, and it has to be ruled that this was illegally taken.
So what happens if, while it's taking several years to go through courts, the person running the Ponzi scheme just moves the money overseas or spends it all?
The U.S. would be able then subpoena the money and get it back. It's as simple as that.
And subpoena money?
Yes. That's how the court system works.
Okay, Bobby, I want to ask you a question about something that you put at the beginning of your speech. You say that the Constitution says no person can be asked to answer for a crime without due process of law. In the case of civil asset forfeiture, where nobody is being asked to answer for a crime, no charges are being levied, how is that possibly a violation of due process if we didn't even get to the threshold wherein we would call on due process to help us clarify procedure?
Could you give me an example?
So somebody takes your money that they suspect to be drug money and then say, you can come get it at the station. This is about how 90% of civil asset forfeiture issues work. But nobody charges you with a crime. So in what sense, then, has your due process been violated?
The very fact that the people were able to take my money without arresting me.
Sure, Bobby, this is, I appreciate your position. I guess I'm asking about the way that you've constructed your case.
Okay.
If due process is one thing, then how could this possibly be a violation of it?
I don't understand your question.
Okay, that's fine.
I have another question about the indefinite detention part of your case.
Sure.
So for starters, does the Constitution apply to non-American citizens who are also not on American soil?
No, that's also why I outlined the NDAA, which allows the federal government to arrest U.S. citizens.
Oh, that's interesting,
indefinitely-
because actually that was my follow-up question, is the NDAA section 1021E says, nothing in this section shall be construed to affect existing law or authorities relating to the detention of U.S. citizens, lawful resident aliens of the United States, or any other persons who are captured or arrested in the United States. So how does the NDAA affect U.S. citizens when it explicitly says that it doesn't?
I mean, obviously that the federal government can circumvent their own bills. The problem here is that there's been many challenges that says is able to use, and the language within the bill is able to be twisted by the federal government to allow the very arrest of citizens.
So there's another case that's important here, and it's the 2002 case, ODA v. U.S., and essentially it was a bunch of people who had been detained at Guantanamo Bay who were non-U.S. citizens were petitioning the Supreme Court for habeas corpus, which essentially says either charge me with a crime or let me go. The Supreme Court denied their petition because they said that they could not see, quote, how or why the writ of habeas corpus will be made available to aliens abroad when even basic constitutional protections are not. So hasn't the Supreme Court already settled this issue?
No, that's why Guantanamo Bay and others still exist today. Regardless, the 2014 Act allows the very detention of American citizens.
Right, but if the Supreme Court says that Guantanamo Bay is constitutional, again, how does your argument, how are you going to say it's not?
Again, the 2014, or I'm confused by your question. I argue that American citizens can be taken by federal government and put into places like Guantanamo Bay because of the 2014 Act, which supersedes the ruling by the Supreme Court.
Okay, I think that's all the cross-ex time.
Good? Yeah, okay. The world of the affirmative has painted civil asset forfeiture and indefinite detention as extremely harmful and has given various examples of abuse within those who carry out the law. The problem with this is, especially in the context of federal law, is that it does not look at the overall reach of the legislation. No government is perfect, and laws don't always work exactly as we expect them to. If it did, things like criminals and corruption wouldn't exist in the first place. However, that is not the reality we live in, and instead we should look at the bigger picture of the laws being discussed today. So first, let us understand the legality of civil asset forfeiture. In terms of violating the Constitution, the case United States versus James Daniel Good Property gives us a really good understanding of the process by which assets can be seized legally. In this case, the Supreme Court held that property may not be seized at all, even with a warrant based on probable cause, until the property owner has been given notice and an opportunity to be heard in the court of law. This proves that under the actual basis of the law, civil asset forfeiture upholds the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment. Moreover, the forfeiture verdict must be based on a preponderance of admissible evidence, not the probable cause evidence that was sufficient for the seizure. So this tells us that all of Bobby's examples from the last speech are just cherry-picked to show you that cops sometimes mess up. But in reality, civil asset forfeiture doesn't even allow this to happen. So clearly, the basis of civil asset forfeiture does not violate the Fifth Amendment, and it gives numerous opportunities for due process to be had in the legal system. But civil asset forfeiture isn't just legal, it's also necessary. The legislation is useful because it is geared towards unique types of crimes. Under federal law, things like drug money can be forfeited either civilly or criminally, but things like firearms, gambling proceeds, and counterfeiting paraphernalia can only be forfeited civilly. proving that the scope of the legislation is key to combating hard-to-catch offenses. Additionally, it is often used to stop the illegal poaching of endangered species, a crime that is already hard for law enforcement to prosecute because officers can seize the illegal material, i.e. an illegally poached shark fin, but they cannot seize the boat or the nets that were used in the process. In fact, it is so much of a problem that the court case United States versus approximately 64,000 pounds of shark fins actually exists. This case was actually important, though, because it allowed the government the opportunity to shut the operation down completely by not only prosecuting the fins, but it gave them the ability to take away the assets that were used in the crime. This has contributed to a major deterrence. The New York Law Review, written by Roger Pilon, a senior fellow and director at the Center for Constitutional Studies, argues that civil asset forfeiture is beneficial for 3 reasons. First is it takes the profit out of crime. Second is it denies criminals the means of crime. And lastly, it punishes criminals for the crimes that they commit. So now that we understand the whole story on civil asset forfeiture, let us explore the topic of indefinite detention. Now, the reason indefinite detention is such a troubling issue for Bobby over here is that it reminds him of most of his time spent in middle school. But for many, including Bobby, the law has been gravely misunderstood. It has been interpreted so incorrectly, which was shown in the last speech, that the newest section of the law in the NDAA that discusses indefinite detention has been rewritten for further clarity. It states, quote, "Nothing in this section shall be constructed to affect existing law or authorities relating to the detention of United States citizens or lawful resident aliens of the U.S." This phrasing explicitly states that indefinite detention doesn't apply to citizens of the U.S. This brings us to an important question. Can something violate the Constitution if it doesn't apply to its citizens? The answer is obviously no, because the Constitution can only apply to individuals in which the Constitution protects in the first place. Now, this line of thinking is supported by the Kansas Law Review and their example of 21 German citizens who were convicted of war crimes and were held in a U.S. prison in occupied Germany following the end of World War II. Now, the court declined to hear their petitions for indefinite detention because they were not U.S. citizens, and therefore no constitutional rights were actually violated. So now that we've got that covered, let's see who this law actually applies to. Section 1022 is very specific in that it identifies only individuals who have, quote, planned or participated in an attack against the U.S. can be detained. So yes, if an individual tries to bomb the U.S., they are allowed to be held indefinitely. But is that really too much to ask for? If you don't want to be held by the U.S. government, don't carry a bomb in your underwear. It's really simple. Indefinite detention is absolutely necessary to deter terrorism because the risk is infinite. If indefinite detention didn't exist, the threat of terror would result in a lot of fear for Americans because every criminal would know that they're eventually going to get out. We need this in place in order to show them that you might be held under further jurisdiction of law.
Arielle?
Yeah.
So my first question is, you say that the courts have decided if you're not a citizen, you don't get protection.
Yes.
Yes. So is that to say that any foreign national in the United States does not have protection from the government by the law?
No, it's not any foreign national. It is specific to whether or not you can be detained and whether or not the constitutional rights apply in this instance.
Sure. So if no constitutional rights are going to be given to non-citizens, what protections exist?
For
I'm
non-citizens.
again curious about the way that you've framed your argument.
Right. I mean, I think that there are like basic moral codes that the U.S. abides by. We have like international criminal laws.
That's interesting because there was some recent news about an illegal black site funded and used by the Chicago police to house and detain thousands of people, to torture them and interrogate them without due process. How can you possibly stand up in the face of that and say that that's not a violation of the constitutional rights of citizens?
Again, that's an example of a bad cop. But does the court rule it unconstitutional? Yes.
How is the police department of the third largest city in the United States using a massive operation like the CIA uses all over the planet to detain, torture, and interrogate people, one bad cop?
My argument is that, okay, it might not be one bad cop, maybe it's an entire city, but once the government institutes policies such as this, they actually have conducted many audits. President Obama's most recent executive order mandates that you have to have an audit every 180 days that indefinite detention occurs. They're doing things to try to stop this. I'm not going to defend every single instance of the United States federal government.
Okay, I have another question on the subject of indefinite detention. Do there exist laws in the U.S. criminal code against planning a terror attack or engaging in a terror attack?
I don't know if there's a specific one. There probably should be.
So then why can't the people accused of those crimes just be tried in a court of law before a jury of their peers? Why do we have to hold them indefinitely instead of examining the evidence to see if they're guilty or innocent?
Well, one is that courts take a really long time. And the second is that just because you kind of contain one person in the situation, you find like the ringleader of somebody you tried to plot a terrorist attack, doesn't mean that you found all of the henchmen. So it's necessary to detain them so that people know that we're serious and that you're not going to get out in 5 years and allowed to do whatever you wanted to do before.
So courts take a long time. Do courts take forever? Or why can't the person be held in jail like the normal process is and then put on trial and then either found innocent and get out in a period of months or, found guilty and put in jail for presumably a long time if they're plotting a terror attack? Why is the indefinite
Because
detention
the
necessary?
risk should be high enough that they know that they will not get out of jail in 25 years or whatever the minimum sentence is for their crime. They should know that there is the potential that you could be held indefinitely, and that's terrible. So you shouldn't commit the crime.
Arielle, I have a question about civil asset forfeiture.
Okay.
Your justification says that it takes the profit out of crime, it denies the means to commit crime, and it punishes criminals. I would add that a lot of advocates for civil asset forfeiture say that it also equips law enforcement with resources to fight crime by taking those very resources and then reappropriating them. But at a more general level, how does that not create an incentive to trump up charges, to fake evidence, and to seek out bad informants to get money out of people, especially as state and local budgets are shrinking?
Well, I would say that one, the fact that state and local budgets are shrinking is probably a reason why we should keep it there in the first place. For example,
A reason or a perverse incentive?
No, I think it's a reason. I think to assume that every single cop in the U.S. is going to use it for malicious intent is one, false. But second, there was a police office in North Carolina that actually used the money they received to go and conduct local search and rescue missions so people didn't die on the streets.
So you mentioned that not every cop is going to be bad, but obviously there are going to be some bad apples out there, and there's a lot of evidence there. What oversight process is in place to make sure that that money gets returned to people if it's...
Like I said, there are numerous audit processes, and so...
Can you give an example of when money has been returned without the victim having to go through a several-year-long court case?
Yes. Since 2012, the Department of Justice has turned over $1.5 billion to 400,000 different individual crime victims and in police
crime
departments.
victims. Let me stop you
Yes.
there. Those aren't the people that the money was taken from. Those are victims of the crimes. That's the Ponzi scheme example I gave last time. I'm asking for an example of when the money was given back to the people that it was seized from.
Bobby's own example said that he went to court and then got his property back.
After 2 years?
I mean, he got it back. Due process, didn't say it's fast process, it's due process. You get it.
So does the issue of civil asset forfeiture and the incentives to engage in civil asset forfeiture begin and end with the seizing of money?
I mean, no, it's not just money. Like I gave the example of the court case of 64,000 pounds of shark fins that were tried.
So the actual item is irrelevant. The question I'm asking is, what else does it cause people to do, right? Does it cause things like no-knock raids to become more prevalent, or does it cause people to seek arrests without warrant because of that money, is the question I'm asking. And then shouldn't we evaluate the implications of civil asset forfeiture based on the types of things that it justifies and invites that do harm to people?
Yes, but that's not the topic. The topic is whether or not it violates due process, not whether or not it would create incentives for cops to do bad things. That's not what I have to defend.
Okay.
Thanks.
I think that's the cross-ex time, so.
So Arielle's speech, she tries to be funny, and then she makes some jokes, but none of it really makes sense once you sit down and think about it. She says all of my arguments are cherry-picked, yet provides no actual real-world examples where people have their money taken, and then 10 minutes later they can just go to the local police department and get it back. Because that's not what happens. When you're near the border and the police thinks you're carrying too much money, they just say, you're carrying drug money. We're taking that from you, so you can't get that back to Mexico. The Donald Trump argument that everybody who's near the border is obviously a drug dealer. The problem is that they then spend this money themselves. In 1985, or in before, the civil assets would have to go through government measures and then go through things like the government treasury. But now, local police departments are simply able to keep all of the money and spend it themselves. She brings up this example about endangered shark fins and about how this has created such a backlash in the community of the shark fins. Yet none of this is contextualized to American citizens who've had their money taken away. She also says that it's used as a deterrent and to take away the profits of criminal organizations. If any of this was true, why would major criminal organizations exist in the United States today? All that happens is that governments take the money and then fund themselves so they can militarize against things like Ferguson, and they could have tanks that roll through the streets. Let's talk about now the indefinite detention. She seems to think that this is just, you can go to prison for life, but it's simply that you can go to prison without knowing when you're able to get out. For example, when they brought up the Chicago black sites, a 15-year-old boy was taken away from his mother and arrested, and then interrogated for 13 hours. When his mother brought an attorney to the actual police department, they were refused access. So for then 13 hours without a legal guardian or legal protection, this boy was then interrogated. And that's just one of the thousands of cases that has happened in places like Chicago. We wouldn't know about this if this wasn't leaked by some federal informant or something, and it probably happens in the other major cities around the United States as well, such as New York and Los Angeles. She says it reminds me of my time in middle school. Cool, I was in detention in middle school. You caught me. But this has nothing to do with people who are taken from their families and sent overseas to Abu Ghraib and Abu Dhabi, where they're then sexually abused, put on leashes, and taken around the facilities. She says that you can be arrested if you attack the United States of America or plan to attack. The problem with this is that the federal government can deem any of us as somebody who's going to then attack the federal government. And then they can then spin that so that you can be arrested. A more contextualized example would say the Black Lives Matter organization are planning a protest. This is an attack on the federal government. You are now all indefinitely arrested, or not even arrested. You're just shipped off to somewhere. The final place is that she says it deters terrorism. It obviously does not deter terrorism. People who are willing to give up their lives to attack the United States aren't really caring about the federal statutes that we have in place. Like they were pressing her on earlier, the problem is with American citizens and the way that the law is able to be spun into arresting federal citizens and locking them up indefinitely without a charge.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Now, Bobby has tried to go for your heart. He's given you all of these terrible stories that I agree are not something that we want to hear being part of the U.S. and citizens of a great country. But I'm going to go for your mind. Remember what Dr. Todd Graham said at the beginning of the debate before it even started. He said that all I have to do is prove that one of them doesn't violate due process. I don't have to convince you that it's the most amazing policy the U.S. has ever passed in the entire world. I just have to prove to you that it doesn't violate the Constitution. And I think I've done that today with our example of civil asset forfeiture. Now, I'm going to focus on this issue specifically because I think it was not handled well by the affirmative team. For example, if we think back to that really important Supreme Court ruling about the Supreme Court versus the James Daniel Good property, they said that you have to have a warrant. And even if you have a warrant, you then have to have a notice to the defendant and give them an opportunity to be held in the court of law. Now, if that isn't due process, I don't know what is. Which means that yes, while there may be a couple of instances in which the court takes a really long time to give something back, it doesn't mean that it isn't being constitutionally upheld, which remember is the only thing I have to show you in the debate round today. Now, not only do I think that that's true, but I also think that it's just kind of a good thing in general when we talk about the way in which there is the ability for illegal poaching to occur absent civil forfeiture. Now, the reason I say this is true is because I give the example of how somebody can be arrested or the shark fins can be put on trial, but if you don't take away the assets that were used in the crime in the first place, who's to stop all the other fishermen that were on that boat from just hopping right back on once their ringleader is in court? That's why taking away the assets in it is important, and that's why constitutional scholars, such as the one from the Stanford Law Review, agree with me. Now, let's go on to talk about some of the indefinite detention arguments. Bobby says, that a young Chicago boy was black-sided, and that's terrible, but that is not to say that, one, we don't know all of the details of this story, we don't know if he was a citizen or not, but two, under the court of law, this would actually be deemed unconstitutional if they were a citizen. So if this were to go to court, the court would actually rule based on prior standings that this would be unconstitutional because they were a citizen. Additionally, Bobby says that, any person will be spinned by the U.S. as somebody who's trying to commit a crime. But remember, protests are allowed by the First Amendment. And also, it's important because when we don't know whether or not a terrorist will happen, we have to just try to protect the overall lives of citizens. So now let's just talk about some of Bobby's arguments from the last couple of speeches. Bobby says that civil asset forfeiture is this, underpinning of all of the crimes that police try to target, and that if you're on the border, that's where the cops are going to go to first because, you're the one who has all the money. But the problem is that if these policies weren't instituted, a lot of police departments would actually not be able to do their job effectively. A great example of this is the Arizona Department of Public Safety that said, their budget officer said that without money from the seizures that they get, lawfully, remember, because they're actually legal because you have to give a warrant, the agency would struggle very tremendously with just meeting their daily meeting their daily budget needs and just carrying out basic procedures to protect the lives of individuals. So while yes, it may not be the most ideal case, it is something that police departments definitely need in order to operate. And the risk that, you don't have police officers protecting your community, it's a lot more likely that something bad happens to a smaller set of individuals than it is that every single cop is bad and is trying to hurt you. All those other good cops, which is the majority of them, would like to do their job and would like to have money in their salary to be able to continue out with law enforcement. Now, when we talk about the affirmative's arguments in reference to indefinite detention, yes, it's true that, waterboarding and torture occur, but are those part of the due process debate that we are discussing today? And the answer is no. And additionally, it's not about, the Fifth Amendment. Do many people think that waterboarding and torture are terrible? Yes. But it's a matter of whether or not we get access to a time and a place to have a civil court. Now, at the end of the day, I just want you to remember that it's a really easy thing to do to pick out a bunch of examples in which the cops have been terrible. I could, talk about how my brother is the worst person ever and give you millions of examples, but overall, I still appreciate him as a person. That Bobby's not my brother, if that was confusing. But, there's always going to be a couple rotten eggs, but you have to look at the overall view of the debate and whether or not it's just a good idea in general to have. We do have a large government, and so we have to expect a small amount of corruption with all of the good that it does.
All right, thank you, Arielle. So we're now going to open it up a bit for y'all to get involved. We have an 8-minute grand cross-examination. So if you have a question for either debater about any of the issues that have been discussed, feel free to raise your hand. Ben and I will be walking around with these handy portable mics to take your questions. Might be launching into some questions of our own. So anyone?
In fact, I'll launch with a question. Bobby, what's your problem with Abu Dhabi? I've heard it's a lovely city. But more seriously, Arielle, are you familiar with the origins of due process? That's good. That's fine, because I am.
Okay,
So
cool.
due process,
Yeah.
right, the notion of due process originates from the 39th clause of the Magna Carta, in fact, where it says that it's a question of common law, that some things are just held intrinsically just and unjust. So we come back to the question of due process as an issue of common law and fundamental rights. In what world is it not a violation of my fundamental rights for my property to be seized without an investigation, without charge, or without warrant, or for my body to be held and mutilated by a government authority without that permission or without due process?
That's a good question, Ben.
Well,
Eager
Ben,
to hear
if
the
you
answer.
listen to my last two speeches, I gave the same example that I'm going to reference again, is that the Supreme Court ruled in the U.S. versus James Daniel Good Property that 1, you must have a warrant, 2, you must notify the defendant, and 3, you must allow them to be heard in court.
Okay, so there haven't been cases maybe since then? Because what I know is that the ACLU and a number of other advocacy groups say that we have a rash of thousands of police departments, both large and small, who are taking people's money without any justification and then never giving it back. Who's right?
Well, if we look at it constitutionally, Constitution would say all of you are bad, but like I said before, the courts don't have time to go out and prosecute everybody. But do they think it's wrong? Yes. That's all I have to defend.
Would
Right,
they-
then back here, I've got a question
Okay.
from Andrea. Go ahead.
I actually have a series of questions for you. In your argument, you talked about how there were shark fins that were seized, and you implied that the government should have taken the boat instead to prevent other people from going and committing the same crime. So my question to you is, if that's the case, and I agree with you, why didn't the government just take the boat instead of the fins? And then aren't the fins more valuable and profitable than the boat? And if the government can sell the seized property for profit and keep it, it seems like even the civil asset forfeiture as it's being used now is not used to prevent crime, but to go after profit because they have the right to sell the fins and keep the profit. Do you agree with that?
I'm going to try to answer all those series of questions as best as I remember. So first, the reason why I said the court case was super awesome was because it actually did take away the boat and the nets. So I think that was a great example of why the assets being seized was more important than just putting the fins on trial, right? So previously, before this case, or before civil asset forfeiture, we would just allow the property to be discussed. But now we say that it's important to have the things that were used to commit the crime taken away also. And then in reference to whether or not it provides an incentive for profit, I mean, I don't know the minds of every police officer. I don't know if I'm out there like, hey, I'm going to go get some money today. But in the instances in which they do garner money and they are audited sufficiently, a lot of the police departments actually use it for good. And they do the Department of Justice has tried to return a lot of that money back to its original crime victim. Or they go through the court process, which remember is also part of due process. And when they go through the court process, they are then also allowed to say, hey, you seized this legally. I promise I wasn't doing anything wrong. Give it back.
There was a case recently, I think in Michigan, of 2 parents who had owned their home, and their son was caught selling weed, and the government took the people's home that was already paid for. Their mortgage was completely zeroed out, but because their son was selling weed, they attributed him selling weed to him storing it in the house, and they took the people's house. Do you think that that does not violate the Fifth Amendment?
I mean, I don't know the specifics of that case, but under the law that's been upheld till now by the Supreme Court, they would actually have to, yes, seize the property, but then they'd have to show proof of a warrant, just like when you go to arrest somebody and you break into their house on the cop shows, you got to be like, hey, I got a warrant, don't worry. So that process would have to occur, as well as they would have to notify them well in advance to come and try to get the property back.
Bobby, I have a question. Did you think you were just going to stand there for 8 minutes and nobody was going to say a word?
I mean, I was kind of
Trying
hoping.
to.
I know you were hoping. So, is questions of governance, especially as they relate to the Constitution, are those ever simply questions of violate the Constitution, yes, no, or does the court sometimes use different approaches to measure violations and then allow them or disallow them?
I think it's more of the latter sometimes. It's definitely
Okay, so
has to be done on a
then you're
case-by-case
familiar with the
basis.
notion of compelling state interest.
Yes.
All right. Just so we're clear, right, Justice Anthony Kennedy in Romer v. Evans says that law enacted for broad and ambitious purposes often can be explained by reference to legitimate public policies which justify incidental disadvantages they impose on certain persons. So if we identify a compelling state interest, whether it be to prevent bodily harm to citizens or whether it to be to prevent some other harm from befalling us, how then should we be weighing the need to protect people against the need to protect their constitutional rights?
So I'm going to try to simplify this a bit to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. If we say that somebody has a gun, should those people be able to have that gun taken away to prevent bodily harm?
I mean, in an incident where there is reason to suspect of likely incident in the future, we might say yes. I mean, think about it this way. Generally, you can justify detaining somebody if you think they represent a threat and then release them or not release them afterwards. I guess my question is, if it stops just one incident, if it saves any number of people's lives, then isn't some amount of inconvenience justified?
I mean, that goes back to my point that when you're on the border, you can have your money taken away because it's funding criminal organizations and the cartels and all of that. So it seems very problematic to assume that the government can predict and stop all of these atrocities that will happen.
Well,
All
but
right, now
what
that
if-
we've kept Bobby on the hot seat for a minute or two here, I've got a question from Gwen here.
All right, and this is for you, based on things that she's been saying. Give me 2 seconds. 2 seconds.
Take your time.
Okay, so about this kind of catastrophic implications of all the laws that are coming through, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
What do you say about due process and this interaction possibly letting taxpayers off the hook in supporting adequate public defense?
Rephrase your question a little bit.
That was terrible. I'm sorry for the time, too.
No, it's fine.
Okay, so if one of the justifications for this is that it helps fund local police departments.
Okay, I see what you mean. Well, the problem with that is that not always, well, I don't think the money that we get from things like shelling shark fins should be given to local governments. The problem is that they're able to take these assets, Gwen, and then just use the money for whatever they want. So in the example that she gave where they took 1 billion shark fins or whatever the exact number was, the government can then sell it off and then get the money themselves. The problem with that is that the justice that it's supposed to be helping is not the justice that they actually want. They just want more funds for the local government.
Okay, Arielle, I actually want to ask a few questions to you. First of all, have you ever received money as a gift from, like, your bubby or somebody? Presuming you might call somebody your bubby. I don't know.
Yes.
Okay. And have you ever been pulled over by the police?
No.
No. Do you
I'm
know
a
anybody
driver.
who has?
No.
Yes, you do. I have. So we'll cut to the quick on this one. I have never, for example, I've been pulled over. I've never been pulled over with $25,000 worth of cash that represents my life savings in the seat next to me that I couldn't prove was mine.
Yeah.
But if I had been, don't you think the police in the course of conducting the stop might say, that's a lot of cash for you to be carrying around on a Wednesday afternoon?
I mean,
Because I want to ask this question because we need to talk about how civil asset forfeiture actually works,
okay.
right? So if I'm driving around and somebody sees $25,000 in my broke down Passat, right? I don't look like I have $25,000, and it's because I don't. They might think that's suspicious, right?
You know
And in
what
an
their first
effort to
question would
curtail
be?
the trade of drugs or other criminal items,
Yeah.
they might take it from me and tell me that I have to prove that it's not been involved in a crime. But I don't have a receipt. So am I just out $25,000 even though I wasn't selling drugs to anybody?
Well, the question the police officers, and I think everybody else wants to know is, where did you get the $25,000 from?
My bubby gave it to me as a gift. See, that's why I asked that question.
I know, that's fine. I think in that instance, yes, it would be up to the police officer's discretion. I see no problem.
So I just am out 25 grand. That's my whole world.
I don't know why you would
that's
just
just?
assume that the police officer would automatically hate you and say, give it to me.
Because this is what happens to people. That's why I bring it up. This is what happens to people. Can you defend that?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I can explain it, but I'm cool.
Sure. One last question for you, Bobby, since your butt has been off the hot seat for a bit here, and then we'll be done with the Grand Cross Acts. Absent the ability for, say, the military or whoever to indefinitely detain people, wouldn't they just kill suspected terrorists via drone strikes or assassinations, and why is that not worse?
They do that already. That's unconstitutional, as it turns out.
Okay. Snappish point from young Swetz. Ben did his best, and then I just had to throw out a softball for the end here. So now we'll have the closing speeches from the debaters, first Arielle and then Bobby, and then we'll get your final vote and see who won and all of that.
Four minutes this time. Okay. Curveball. All right. This debate comes down to one question. If the affirmative or if the negative team can prove to you that I'm going to choose one of them, and the one that I choose is civil asset forfeiture, gives you at least the chance for due process at least one time during the litigation process or during the time that the asset was seized, then I've won the debate round. That is the only obligation that I have to prove today, and I think I've done it three ways. The first is that I've already proven to you that the Supreme Court has upheld that the police officers have to have a warrant when seizing your property. So in the instance that Ben gave you, if my wonderful Jewish grandmother decided to slip me a gift of $25,000 in my car, one is that, I would assume in the instance that a police officer pulled me over, he would ask me why I had that. I would then be able to give a logical and justifiable defense. Then if my asset was seized and detained, I can go to the court. I am given notice, which is the second reason why we have due process. I am given notice to come to court and say, look, this is really not reasonable. I can even bring Bubby with me and say, yeah, I gave that to her. She's my favorite grandchild. And then after that happens, I am not only allowed that, but I am allowed to, appeal the process and say, hey, you guys ruled wrong again. Let's fix this in the court system. So there are three different instances in which due process is not only provided, but also guaranteed under the Constitution and the law of the United States. Now, Bobby will come up here and tell you about all of the terrible, terrible instances in which cops were like, hey, that's a lot of money. I'm just going to take it and keep it and go buy more Snickers bars. And that may be true, and it may happen a couple of times, but is it ruled constitutional, and does it violate the Fifth Amendment? The answer to that question is no. And because there are occasionally a couple of instances, or because the common law practice may not be 100% to the level that the Supreme Court would like, does not mean that I have lost the debate round. Yes, there's always going to be a couple of instances in which one side doesn't do things correctly or isn't audited. So guess what? We have a couple of criminals over here. But that doesn't mean that if you go to the Supreme Court or you ask a constitutional scholar, is this overruled by the Fifth Amendment, that they will not agree with this side. Now, a couple of other things that Bobby might try to tell you is that, it's ridiculous to have inanimate objects on trial and that, we shouldn't be taking the property in the first place. But think about it this way. Do inanimate objects have constitutional rights? The answer is no. So, going back to the beginning of the debate when Ben so nicely explained that when we try assets in court, we try them as the asset themselves. We don't say, we don't try me in court if my money is taken away. We try the $10,000 that was sitting in the rest of my car. That means that the asset itself is not guaranteed constitutional rights either, because guess what? It's an asset. It's an inanimate object. We don't grant, we don't tax money because we don't tax things that are inanimate, right? And we don't grant them constitutional rights either. So when you're thinking about this in a general sense, there are a multitude of reasons as to one, due process is guaranteed. And if you don't think due process is guaranteed in the instance of civil asset forfeiture, then it doesn't matter because it wasn't supposed to be guaranteed in the first place because it's an inanimate object. So when we think about the debate today, yes, there's going to be a lot of arguments for or against both sides, but just think in the back of your head, do I think I get a reasonable chance at fighting for my asset? Yes. Do I think I get to get my money back at the end of the day? Yes. Does it take a little bit of time? Probably. You can blame, the 19,000 court cases that we have and all of the other laws on the books, but do you at least, under the guise of the Supreme Court of the United States, get your fair chance? The answer to that question is yes, which means that there's no reason as to why it would violate the Fifth Amendment and no reason as to why you would be treated any differently than another individual fighting for their same freedoms.
So I applaud Arielle for that very passionate speech, but there is one problem that she was just missing in the entirety of her speech, and that's regarding the local police departments that take civil assets and then use them for their own benefit. She just talks about how you can go get your money back. What happens if the money's gone? Is a very good question. What happens if the shark fins that were confiscated by the federal government to protect endangered sharks is just gone? Because it was then sold off to fund the militarization of places like Ferguson. She says that we can go to court after they have taken our money and we can get it back. The problem with this is that that costs money to actually do. You have to hire a lawyer because you have to go against the federal government to get your assets back. In the example I gave in my first speech about McClellan, who had $100,000 simply taken out of his bank account, he spent almost a year trying to get that back. He spent $20,000 alone just to get his money back. All of her arguments presume that you are guilty until proven innocent. You are guilty because you have that money, we are taking it. Now you have to go to court and you have to prove you are innocent. You have to appeal your decision and prove you're innocent. All of this costs a ton of money and is super unconstitutional simply because it is on the basis that you are wrong, you are guilty, but we can take your money and then we can go spend it on cops who sit there with their radar guns saying, you're going 55, speed limit's 50, you're going down, man. Another problem is the exact example that he gave, where I'm going to give you some background. His girlfriend's name is Haley, and they're super adorable. What if Haley simply gave him $25,000 that he had in a briefcase sitting in his car? Could they then take that money? Because there's no reason this man should have $25,000 on him. We have to take a look at the big picture and what actually happens. She says that all the examples I give are cherry-picked and that there are multiple examples of the government doing good. But she doesn't give any examples. That is one thing that's missing in all of her speeches, that she just does not give examples besides one court case where they took a bunch of fins. And then on the concept of things that she said in the previous speech, she said that they need a warrant to take your money. The problem with that is it doesn't happen, number one. And number two, even if they had a warrant, it doesn't mean you're able to go to court and still retain the money that you have. It is simply taken away from you with a warrant and then just given to the local police departments. She says it's a good thing in general, but there's no reason why that's a good thing in general. She says that the random Arizona racist police defense needs some money so they can make sure the Mexicans aren't going to get over the border because they took our jobs. But the main point is that these local police departments don't actually need this money. They just want more money so that they'll take poor Ben Reid's $25,000.
One last thing to do before we go. I want to thank the debaters first and the Dog Pound for a nice, excellent job today. Let's vote. If you still don't have an opinion, that's fine, but I'm going to ask you to vote in the same order. So those of all of you who thought Bobby won the debate and actually proved that they were violations of due process, please stand. Okay, thank you very much. All of those of you who thought that Arielle won the debate and she proved that at least one did not violate due process, please stand. And if we could have the pre-debate total and the post-debate total, please.
The pre-debate total was 12 in favor of Mr. Swetz, to 5 in favor of Arielle, and our post-debate total is 24 for Bobby, 13 for Arielle. So
Percentages.
the percentage is actually better for Arielle.
All right, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Thank you. There's a reception outside. We have a reception outside. There's punch and cake and things. And please meet the debate team and talk to us. We'd love to have a chat. Thank you very much.